I've worked at the same airport for 11 years, and I can tell you that lost things don't stay lost. Not really. They cycle. Someone leaves a jacket on a Tuesday flight from Denver, and by Thursday, it's sitting in our intake room under fluorescent lights, while I log the description into a database that was already outdated when I started. By the following Tuesday, either the jacket's owner has called in or they haven't, and after 90 days, unclaimed items go to the county donation center. That's the system. It has a rhythm to it, and I've spent more than a decade calibrating myself to that rhythm without thinking much about it. The lost and found at Harwell Regional isn't glamorous. Most airports have their operations somewhere off the main terminal, and ours is no different, a room about the size of a two-car garage tucked behind the baggage claim corridor on the ground floor, past the car rental counters and a vending machine that's been half-stocked for as long as anyone can remember. We have a counter window that faces the corridor, a door that requires a badge, and inside, about 40 linear feet of metal shelving organized by intake, date, and category. Electronics on the left, clothing in the middle, documents and wallets in a locked cabinet, miscellaneous everything else on the right. I'm the supervisor, have been since 2019. Before that, I was just staff, same as the two part-timers I oversee now, Danny, who works mornings Tuesday through Saturday, and Marcus, who does afternoons and covers me on my days off. Neither of them has asked me to explain anything I'm about to tell you. I don't think I'd know how anyway. My name is Joel, and I want to be clear about something before I get into any of it. I am not a person who believes in strange things. I was raised practical. My dad was an electrician. My mom kept the books for a small trucking company. And the house I grew up in was the kind of place where if something broke, you fixed it. And if something scared you, you figured out why. That's the lens I've been looking through my whole life. And even now, even after everything I'm going to describe, I'm still trying to hold on to it. I don't know that I've succeeded. This started around 14 months ago, which puts it in early spring of last year, right around the time my brother Danny got his diagnosis. I want to be careful about how much I say about Danny, partly because it's not entirely my story to tell, and partly because even now, it's hard to find the right distance from it. He's 2 years younger than me. We were close growing up in the way brothers are when they're close in age, and there isn't much money for individual hobbies. You just do everything together by default. That closeness wore thin in our 20s. Not a falling out, nothing dramatic, just the ordinary drift that happens when two people stop living in the same house and start building separate lives. He moved to Phoenix. I stayed near Harwell because the job was stable. We talked on birthdays, at Thanksgiving when we both made it to our mom's place, that kind of thing. The diagnosis was pancreatic. Stage 3, which is what the doctor said, but I looked it up the same night I found out, and I understood what stage 3 meant in real terms. I want to be honest, I didn't handle the news well. I don't mean I fell apart. I mean I went quiet and practical in a way that I now recognize as a way of not feeling it. I called Danny. We talked for 40 minutes, and I told him I'd be there. I meant it. I also went to work the next morning and logged 17 intake items and answered 6 counter inquiries and did not tell Danny or Marcus what was happening because it felt like a fact that belonged only to me until I figured out what to do with it. I bring all of that up because it's the frame. Everything I'm about to describe happened while I was carrying that. And I don't think you can understand the decisions I made without knowing what else was occupying my attention. The first thing I noticed was so minor that I didn't even write it down. It was a Wednesday, mid-morning. Danny had done the overnight intake. We have a drop slot for items found by cleaning crews and gate agents after the last flights, and someone has to sort them each morning. And I was doing my daily walk of the shelves before opening the counter window. It's just a habit. I scan for anything that looks like it might need special handling. Check that nothing's fallen. Make sure the tagging is legible. Takes maybe 8 minutes. The right section, the miscellaneous shelves, runs about 16 feet and holds anything that doesn't fit the other categories. Umbrellas, books, children's toys, sporting equipment, the occasional instrument case. I know what's on those shelves the way you know what's in your own refrigerator, not by memorizing it consciously, but by familiarity. You notice when something's off. On the second shelf from the top, near the far end, there was a canvas tote bag. Dark green, worn at the handles. The kind that every grocery store in the country has been giving away for 20 years. Nothing unusual about it. But I didn't remember logging it, and it didn't have an intake tag. I pulled it down and looked inside. A folded paperback novel, a phone charger the older style, not USB-C, and a pair of reading glasses in a soft case. All perfectly ordinary. I checked the shelf tag slots nearby to see if its tag had fallen off, which happens sometimes when the adhesive gets cold. Nothing. I flagged it on a sticky note, set it back on the shelf, and pulled the overnight log sheet to see if Danny had missed tagging it. The log was clean. 17 items, all accounted for, all tagged. The tote wasn't on the list. I assumed it had come in from a previous shift without being properly entered. It happens rarely, but it happens sometimes. A gate agent drops something directly in the room when we're not there, bypassing the drop slot, and whoever receives it forgets to log it properly in the moment. I wrote it up myself, gave it an intake date of that Wednesday, and put it in the system. I didn't think about it again for almost 2 weeks. The second time, I noticed it because I was specifically looking at that shelf. We'd had a run of umbrellas that month. March is a strange time for umbrella losses. You'd think it would be more, but spring travel brings them out, and I was trying to rearrange the middle shelves to make room. I was using the far right end as temporary overflow, which put me standing in front of the exact spot where I'd found the tote bag. The tote was still there, unclaimed, which wasn't unusual at the 2-week mark. But next to it, on the same shelf, was a blue insulated lunch bag with a small aluminum clasp. It had an intake tag. The tag said it came in 3 days ago, logged by Marcus. I remembered seeing it when Marcus brought it in. But the lunch bag was pushed up against the tote in a way that made them look like they were sitting together. And on top of the lunch bag, resting against the tote's handle, was a folded piece of paper. I unfolded it. It was a boarding pass. The flight number was for a Harwell departure, which is unusual. We almost never get boarding passes for outbound flights, because people don't usually lose those before they've used them. The name on it was smudged in one corner, and I couldn't read it fully. The date on the pass was not a pass date. It was 8 days in the future. I turned it over. Nothing on the back. I stood there for a moment trying to construct a rational explanation, and what I landed on was that someone had printed a boarding pass in advance. People do that. You can print them up to 24 hours before, or with some carriers, further out, and lost it in the terminal. It ended up in the drop slot. Marcus logged it with the lunch bag, by mistake. Didn't notice the date. That explanation worked. Mostly. I put the boarding pass in the documents cabinet, which is where they're supposed to go, and filed a correction note on the intake report. The date on the boarding pass was March 29th. The destination, which I remember clearly, was Phoenix. I am aware of how that sounds. I'm telling you what I noticed, not what I was thinking at the time, because at the time I wasn't thinking anything about Danny. Phoenix is a major hub. Dozens of flights go through Harwell to Phoenix every month. A boarding pass with a future date and a Phoenix destination is not, on its own, meaningful. I did not call Danny that day. I had been calling him about twice a week since the diagnosis, which was more than I'd called him in the previous 2 years combined. And that particular day, I had a late shift and a stack of claim forms to process, and I told myself I'd call him Thursday. I did call him Thursday. He sounded tired, but okay. We talked about whether he was going to try a second opinion, and I told him I thought he should, and he said he'd think about it. The third thing happened on a Tuesday. I came in at my usual time, just before 8, and did my shelf walk. Everything looked normal until I got to the far right end of the miscellaneous section, the same area where the tote bag had been, where it was still sitting unclaimed. The tote was fine, but on the shelf directly above it, the top shelf, which runs about a foot below ceiling height, and which we use for bulkier items like briefcases and backpack-sized bags, there was a gray zip-up hoodie, folded neatly, sitting by itself. It had an intake tag, logged yesterday by Danny, found at gate 14. No identifying information. I looked at it for a long time. It was a gray zip-up hoodie, the kind with a kangaroo pocket in front and a small logo on the left chest. The logo was for a brewery in Tempe, Arizona. I know that brewery. I gave Danny a t-shirt from that brewery 2 Christmases ago because he'd mentioned visiting the tap room with his wife. It was the kind of thing he would wear. I did not touch it. I stood in front of it, and I was aware that my reasoning had started to bend in a direction I didn't trust. The coincidence of the Phoenix boarding pass was one thing. A gray hoodie from an Arizona brewery was another. But my job involves being in proximity to thousands of objects belonging to thousands of people, and pattern recognition is an occupational hazard. You start to see connections that aren't there. A therapist might have a word for it. I walked away, opened the counter window, and started my day. But I took a picture of the hoodie's tag before I did. I don't know why. I didn't look at the picture for 3 days. When I finally looked at it, I noticed that the intake date Danny had written on the tag was March 29th, the same date that had been on the boarding pass. That night was the first night I didn't sleep well in the way that has a specific texture to it. Not insomnia, exactly. More like every time I got close to sleep, my mind handed me the same 2 numbers. March 29th, Gate 14. I don't know why Gate 14 lodged itself in my head alongside the date, except that Harwell's Gate 14 is one of the 3 gates that services Phoenix flights. I told myself I was grieving sideways. I told myself that's a real phenomenon, that people experiencing anticipatory loss start finding meaning in random coincidences because the brain is trying to prepare itself for something it can't otherwise process. I believe that's true. I believed it then. I'm not sure it's the whole explanation now, but I believed it then. I called Danny that Thursday. He told me the second opinion was scheduled. He said he was feeling better than the previous week. He asked how work was, and I said fine, and I didn't tell him about any of it, because what would I have said? The hoodie sat on the top shelf. The tote bag sat on the second shelf. The boarding pass was in the locked documents cabinet. None of them were claimed. That in itself was starting to feel like something, though I couldn't say what exactly. The tote was past 30 days by then, which meant it was eligible for donation. I should have pulled it and added it to the county bin. I didn't. I wrote a note to myself to do it, and then I kept not doing it. Marcus asked me once if we needed to cycle the far right section, and I said I'd handle it. And he moved on. I've worked with Marcus for 6 years. He doesn't ask follow-up questions when I say I'll handle something. That's one of the things I appreciate about him. The fourth thing happened on a Friday, and it was different in kind from the first 3. I was alone in the room Danny had already left, and Marcus wasn't in until noon, processing a claim for a laptop that a man from Cincinnati had left on the shuttle to the terminal. He was a perfectly normal interaction. He was relieved to have the laptop back, showed me his ID and his claim receipt. I retrieved the item, He signed the release form. It took maybe 4 minutes. After he left, I was standing at the counter with the clipboard, marking the item as claimed in the log, when I happened to look down the length of the shelving toward the far right end. The tote bag was open. I had not opened it. I had not been near that end of the room in 2 hours. The room had been locked until I opened for the morning. The drop slot doesn't allow anything large enough to be retrieved by hand from outside. The overnight intake had been sorted, and no one had been back there. The tote bag was sitting on the second shelf with its handles folded down to the sides, the way a bag sits when it's been opened and set back without being closed. Visible inside it, resting on top of the paper bag that had been there since intake, was a small photograph. I walked down there. I'm not sure what my pace was. I wasn't running. I want to be clear about what I did and didn't feel in that moment, because I know the instinct is to assume I was afraid. But what I actually felt was something closer to the way you feel when you've been waiting for a piece of information and it's finally arriving. A kind of tightened attention. I picked up the photograph. It was a snapshot, the kind printed from a phone at a drugstore, slightly glossy. It showed 2 boys, maybe 8 and 10 years old, standing in front of a lake, both in swim trunks. The taller one had his arm around the shorter one's shoulders, and they were both squinting into the sun in the way kids do when someone tells them to look at the camera. I recognized that lake. I recognized those 2 boys. The photograph was of me and Danny. I stood there for probably 2 minutes holding it, maybe less. Time does something unreliable when you're processing something your brain doesn't have a category for, and I don't trust my sense of the duration. The photograph was real. I mean, physically real glossy, slightly curled at one corner the way drugstore prints get when they've been in a wallet or a drawer, with a small white border around the image. The colors were right for an old print, slightly warm. The greens of the tree line behind us a little oversaturated the way photos from that era got. We're wearing swim trunks, I remember. Mine were red with a white stripe. Danny's were navy. We're at Kettle Lake, which is about 40 minutes from where we grew up, where our parents used to take us for a week every August when we were kids. I'm the taller one with my arm around Danny's shoulders. I don't own a copy of this photograph. I didn't know one existed. My mother might have it somewhere, buried in one of the albums she keeps in the hall closet of her house. I haven't looked through those albums in years. I couldn't tell you how a copy of this photograph ended up inside a canvas tote bag in my lost and found, and I still can't tell you that now, and that fact has not gotten easier to sit with. I set it on the counter. I went back to my log. I stood at the counter for about 10 minutes doing nothing, and then I picked up my phone and called my mother. I kept it casual. We talked for a while about the weather and about Danny, and then I asked her if she still had the photo albums from when we were kids. She said of course, they were right where they'd always been. I asked if she remembered the Kettle Lake trips, and she said she thought about those all the time. I asked if she'd ever made copies of any of those photos, sent any to Danny or anyone else. She said she hadn't, as far as she could remember. She said Danny had borrowed one of the albums a few years ago, the one from the early 90s, but had returned it. Why? She asked. I told her no reason, just thinking about old summers. She seemed to accept that. She asked me to call Danny more often, and I said I would, and we hung up. I put the photograph in the documents cabinet next to the boarding pass. Then I pulled them both back out and looked at them, side by side for a moment, which didn't tell me anything useful, and put them back. I called Danny that evening. He sounded better than he had in weeks. The second opinion doctor had some thoughts about the treatment approach. Nothing definitive yet, but Danny said it felt like there might be more options than they'd initially been told. He was cautious about it. He's always been cautious about good news, same as me. I told him that was worth something. That was real. We talked for almost an hour. which was the longest conversation we'd had since before he got sick, maybe longer than that. I didn't tell him about the photograph. I thought about it. There was a moment where I almost said, "Hey, I found something strange at work today." And then I thought about how I would complete that sentence, and I let it go. Danny was dealing with enough, and there was another reason I didn't say anything, one that I'm less comfortable admitting. Some part of me didn't want to disturb whatever was happening. I realize that sounds irrational. It was irrational. But the photo had showed up, and that same evening, Danny was having his best conversation in months. And I know correlation isn't causation, but I was tired and scared, and I let myself feel the two things as connected. That's how it starts to work on you. Not through fear, through hope. Over the next weeks, I started paying closer attention to the far right section of the shelves. I want to be honest about what this looked like from the outside, which is nothing. I wasn't visibly disturbed. I wasn't doing anything a casual observer would have found strange. I was doing my shelf walk every morning with slightly more attention to that corner than usual, and I was checking the overnight log against the physical items more carefully than I normally would. I told myself this was just good practice, better documentation habits. I believed that for about 4 days. On the 5th day, I found a keychain. It had come in through the drop slot overnight, logged by Donnie, found near gate 14 again. It was a small metal disc, the kind you can get engraved at a mall kiosk or a craft fair, with a loop for the keyring on one side and an engraved image on the other. The image was 2 stick figures, one taller, one shorter, with their arms around each other, and below them the word brothers. No keys attached, just the keychain. I sat down when I saw that. Not dramatically, I just needed to sit. There's a rolling stool we keep behind the counter, and I pulled it over and sat on it and looked at the keychain sitting in my palm. I'm trying to be careful here not to construct a tidy narrative, because I know how this sounds when listed out like this. The boarding pass, the hoodie, the photograph, now the keychain, and I know it sounds arranged, like something with a visible intention. At the time, it didn't feel that clean. At the time, it felt more like standing in a room and gradually realizing the furniture has been rearranged, not all at once. Just one chair, slightly out of place, then a table. Then the window is on the wrong wall, and you can't be sure when each change happened because you weren't watching closely enough. What I mean is that it felt cumulative, not theatrical. I kept the keychain. I shouldn't have. Policy is that personal items without identifying information go through the standard intake process, and if I pulled everything from that section that seemed significant to me, I'd have to explain why. So I logged the keychain properly, gave it a shelf spot, but I made a note of exactly where it was. My own note, in my own handwriting, in a small notebook I keep in my jacket pocket. I'd started keeping that notebook about 3 days after I found the photograph. I hadn't acknowledged to myself that I was doing it. The notebook is sitting on my kitchen table right now. Marcus noticed something around the 3rd week. He didn't say anything direct. Marcus is not a direct person, which is different from being a dishonest one. He just observed things without commenting on them, and occasionally the observation would surface as something that sounded like a question, but technically wasn't. He came in one afternoon and did his own circuit of the shelves, the way all 3 of us do out of habit, and on his way back to the counter, he paused at the far right end for a moment longer than usual. "This section's getting full," he said. Not to me specifically, just out loud. "I know. I'm going to cycle it." He nodded. "Some of this is past 90 days. I'll handle it this week." He didn't look at me when he said the next part. He was still facing the shelves. "The tote's been here a while." "I know. Somebody must really not want a phone charger back." He laughed a little. I laughed a little. He went to the counter and I went to the back to finish some paperwork, and neither of us said anything else about it. But that evening, I did something I'd been avoiding. I pulled the original intake record for the tote bag, the one I'd written up myself the morning I found it without a tag, and I looked at the physical description I'd recorded. Canvas tote, dark green, worn handles, contents, 1 paperback novel, 1 phone charger, 1 pair of reading glasses in a soft case. I hadn't written down the title of the paperback. That was my own incomplete documentation, which I noted with some self-criticism. I went back to the shelf and pulled the tote and took out the book. It was a novel I recognized, a thick paperback, the kind of literary fiction that gets assigned in college courses. I'd read it. Danny had given it to me. He'd pressed it into my hands at Thanksgiving maybe 8 years ago and told me I needed to read it, that it was the best thing he'd read in years. I remember thinking it was too long, and then staying up until 2 in the morning 3 nights in a row because I couldn't put it down. I turned to the front page. There was writing there, in the top corner, the way people sometimes write in books they're giving as gifts. The ink was blue, slightly faded, in handwriting I recognized because I grew up watching it on birthday cards and notes left on the kitchen counter. It said, "For Joel, you'll understand why when you get there. D." I closed the book. I set it on the shelf. I stood there with my hands flat against the edge of the metal shelf above it, not gripping it, just resting there, the way you put your hands on a counter when you need a moment without it being obvious that you need a moment. I did not take the book. I did not add it to my private notebook. I just left it there and finished my shift and drove home and sat in my car in the driveway for approximately 20 minutes before going inside. What I was working through, sitting in that car, was not whether something strange was happening. By then, I was past that particular argument with myself. What I was working through was something more uncomfortable. The question of what it meant that I hadn't opened that book in 3 weeks of noticing. The photograph I'd found was a shock. A single image that landed all at once. The inscription was something else. An inscription is a communication. Someone, at some point, had held that book and written my name in it, and said there was something I would understand when I got there. I don't know who wrote it. The handwriting looked like Danny's. I cannot confirm that it was Danny's, because the only examples of Danny's handwriting I have are a few old birthday cards, and I didn't have those with me in the car, and I have not brought myself to do a direct comparison since. There is a part of me that does not want a definitive answer to that particular question, and I'm aware that's a choice I'm making. The next morning I checked Danny's flight history. I can't do that. Officially, passenger manifests are not something lost, and found supervisors have access to, but Danny had mentioned his travel schedule to me in passing because he'd been coming back to see our mother more frequently since the diagnosis. I knew from our conversations that he'd flown through Harwell once, in February, connecting through on his way home from seeing a specialist in Boston. One layover, he'd said, just long enough to grab something from the terminal. Harwell is not a major hub. If you're flying from Phoenix to Boston and back, Harwell is a strange connection point. I asked him about it the first time he mentioned it, and he said it was just what the routing offered, that the timing worked. I hadn't thought anything of it. February was 6 weeks before the first time I noticed the tote bag. I want to be very careful about what I'm claiming here, because I don't think I'm claiming anything specific. I'm describing what I noticed. I'm describing the sequence. Whether those things connect in the way my mind kept trying to connect them, I genuinely don't know. What I know is that by the end of that week, I had stopped cycling the far right section entirely, and I had started arriving 15 minutes before my shift to check it before anyone else came in. And I had not told anyone, not Marcus, not Danny, not my mother, and certainly not Danny. That any of this was happening. I'd also started noticing something about the placement. The items weren't scattered across the section. The tote was always on the second shelf. The hoodie had been on the top shelf. The keychain had come in through the drop slot, and I'd placed it myself. But the spot I'd chosen, without thinking about it, was the third shelf. The boarding pass was in the cabinet, not on the shelves, but when I thought about where it would sit if it were out, it would have been the fourth shelf. Lowest eye level. 4 shelves. 4 items. Each on a different level. I don't know what to do with that. I wrote it in the notebook and then stared at it for a while and then closed the notebook. There might be nothing to do with it. It might be a pattern I'm inventing, because the human brain is aggressively good at finding patterns in random arrangements, and I am a person under sustained emotional stress, and both of those things are true simultaneously. But I have spent 11 years cataloging the spatial logic of these shelves, and I know where things end up when they come in through normal channels, and they don't tend to arrange themselves by vertical position, according to a system only I seem to be tracking. The 5th item came in on a Thursday morning, 11 days after the keychain, and it wasn't on the shelves. It was in the drop slot, which meant it arrived between the previous afternoon when Marcus locked up and 8 in the morning when I opened. The drop slot is sized for items up to roughly the dimensions of a laptop bag. Nothing enormous. Nothing that would require disassembly to fit. Whatever comes through, it lands in a shallow tray on the interior side that we empty during morning intake. The tray held one item, a cassette tape. No case, no label, no identifying information. Just a standard cassette tape with nothing written on it, sitting in the tray like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. We don't have a cassette player in the room. There is no reason for one. The last time anyone in our operation would have had use for a cassette player would have been before I started here, before digital intake systems, before everything. I logged it. Miscellaneous. No description possible beyond the physical object. I put it on the 3rd shelf, next to the keychain, because that seemed like the right place, and I didn't examine that instinct too carefully. Then I went to my car on my lunch break and drove to a thrift store 4 blocks from the airport that I'd passed every workday for 6 years and never entered. And I bought a cassette player for $3. The player was a handheld Sony, yellow plastic, the kind marketed to kids in the 90s for outdoor use. Waterproof casing, a single headphone jack, a belt clip that had lost its screw. The foam on the earbuds was mostly intact. $3 was a fair price. I paid cash, which I don't usually do. And I'm not entirely sure why I didn't want a card record of a $3 purchase at a thrift store, but I didn't. I sat in my car in the thrift store parking lot and put the tape in and pressed play. Static. About 4 seconds of it, the soft, analog hiss that blank tapes make. Then a voice. Danny's voice. I knew it immediately the way you know a voice you've been hearing your whole life, before your brain has even started processing the words. His cadence, the slight flatness he has on certain vowels, the way he clears his throat before he starts a sentence when he's going to say something he's been thinking about for a while. He cleared his throat. He said, "Joel, I don't know if you'll find this in time, or if there even is an in time, the way I'm thinking of it. But I needed to put something where you'd actually look." Then silence. Not blank tape silence. A deliberate pause. The kind someone leaves when they're collecting themselves. "You're going to want to come to Phoenix. Not because I'm asking you to. I know how you are about disrupting things. I'm asking you anyway. Come before the end of April. I mean that. Before the end of April." Another pause. Longer. "There's something I haven't told you. I should have told you a long time ago. I kept thinking there'd be a better moment. And then the moments kept going by. And now there's the situation with everything. And I realized the better moment was all of them that I let go by. His voice changed on the last part. Not dramatically. He just got quieter. I'm not going to say it on this tape. Some things you have to say to a person's face. I just need you to come. I need you to actually come, Joel. Because I know you, and I know how easy it is for you to mean something, and then find a reason why this week doesn't work, and then the next week. And he stopped, cleared his throat again. I found the Kettle Lake picture, Mom's album. I made a copy because I wanted you to have it. I didn't know how to give it to you without it being a whole thing, so I put it somewhere you'd find it. I'm sorry that's strange. I think I've been strange about a lot of things. The tape ran for another few seconds. Just hiss. Then it clicked off, because it reached the end. I sat in the parking lot for a long time. I'm going to tell you what I understood in that parking lot, and I'm going to tell you what I didn't understand, because those are two different lists, and they matter. What I understood: Danny had recorded this tape. Danny had, somehow, placed these items where I would find them. The photograph, the book with the inscription, the keychain he'd been through Harwell in February. He'd had access to the room or to the drop slot, and he'd arranged something. The tape confirmed the photograph. It confirmed the inscription. It gave me a reason for all of it that was strange and elaborate, but human. Danny being Danny, doing something sideways and indirect because he didn't know how to do the direct version of it. What I didn't understand: how. The logistics of how. I had been in that room. I knew its rhythms. I knew what came through the drop slot and when. I knew the morning intake logs better than I knew most things in my life. The tote bag had appeared without an intake record. The boarding pass had arrived with a future date. The photograph had moved inside the bag between my first examination and my return to the shelf, and the bag had been in a locked room while it moved. Danny had been in Harwell once, in February, before any of this started. He was in Phoenix. He was sick. He was not making repeated, unannounced trips to my Lost and found to rearrange items and slip recordings into a drop slot that requires you to be standing in a public corridor to use. And yet, the voice was his. The photograph was real. The inscription in the book was in handwriting that looked like his. These were not things I'd imagined. I drove back to the airport. I finished my shift. I did not tell Marcus what had happened. I went home and I booked a flight to Phoenix for the following weekend, and then I sat at my kitchen table and turned the cassette player over in my hands for a while, and then I called Danny. He answered on the third ring, sounding tired, but present. We talked about his treatment schedule. I told him I was thinking about coming out to see him. He said that would be great, that he'd like that Rachel, his wife, would be glad to have me. His voice was normal, warm. Not the voice of someone who had recently confailed a tape recording into a drop slot at the airport where his brother worked. I said, "Hey, when you came through Harwell in February, did you stop by the Lost and Found?" A pause. "What?" "Just wondering if you stopped by my work, the Lost and Found counter." "Joel, I had a 40-minute layover. I got a sandwich. Why would I go to the Lost and Found?" He sounded genuinely confused, not covering anything. I know when Danny is covering something because he gets very specific and slightly too cooperative, a habit he developed as a kid and never lost. This was just confusion. "No reason," I said. "I thought I saw you on one of the terminal cameras and I wasn't sure." That was a lie. We don't have access to the terminal cameras from our room. I don't know why I said it instead of the truth. "I definitely didn't come by," he said. "I barely made my connection. You should have been at the gate. I could have seen you." We talked for a little longer and hung up. I sat with the phone on the table. Here is the thing I kept circling back to. Danny didn't sound like someone who had left me a tape recording asking me to visit. He sounded like someone who didn't know what I was talking about. He sounded genuinely pleased, in a natural, uncalculated way, when I said I was thinking about coming to see him. Not like someone who'd been hoping the elaborate plan had worked. Like someone hearing good news for the first time, which meant either Danny had left these items in some dissociated state he didn't consciously remember, which is not a thing I believe happens, or something else was arranging items in my lost, and found that knew enough about me and Danny to be precise about it. Precise enough to use his voice. I did not sleep well that night. Not because I was afraid, because I was trying to construct a version of events that made coherent sense, and kept failing. I went into work the next morning and checked the shelves before opening and found a sixth item. It was on the fourth shelf, the lowest eye-level shelf, which was where I'd mentally mapped the boarding pass when I thought about the vertical arrangement. The item was a small spiral notebook, college-ruled, the wire binding slightly bent. It had an intake tag, logged by the drop slot at some point during the night, and the tag was in Danny's handwriting because Danny had opened that morning before I arrived and sorted the overnight intake. I found Danny at the counter, the spiral notebook on the far right. Fourth shelf. Did anything seem unusual about it when you pulled it from the tray? Danny looked up. The black one? No. Why? Was there anything with it? No, just the notebook. It was right on top, actually, like it had just been dropped. I figured an early morning cleaning crew person. Why? Is something wrong with it? No. Thanks. I took the notebook to the back. The cover was blank. Inside, the first 12 pages were empty. On the 13th page, in the same handwriting as the book inscription, the handwriting that looked like Danny's, there were 2 columns. The left column was a list of dates. The right column, next to each date, was a single word or short phrase. I'm going to write out what the list said, because I've had it memorized since the morning I read it, and there's no point in being vague about it now. The dates ran from March 4th, which was the morning I'd found the tote bag, to April 22nd. The entries on the left side matched, close enough to confirm, the dates when each item had appeared. March 4th, the tote. March 16th, the boarding pass. March 19th, the hoodie. March 29th, the photograph. April 3rd, the keychain. April 14th, the tape. Today was April 15th. The notebook was April 15th. The right column, next to each date, read, found, looked, noticed, kept, stayed, listened, reading. The last entry, April 15th, next to reading, had a line beneath it. Below the line, there was one more entry. The date was April 22nd. The right column next to it was blank, just an empty space where a word should have been. And below that, at the bottom of the page, a single sentence. The last one isn't lost yet. I closed the notebook. I set it on the table in the back room. I looked at the wall for a moment. Then I opened it again and read everything twice more to make sure I hadn't misread anything. And I hadn't. April 22nd was 7 days away. The pattern I'd been half tracking, the one I'd written in my own private notebook, and then avoided thinking about too directly, was now written in someone else's hand, someone else's arrangement of dates that I had not shared with anyone. The dates were correct. The sequence was correct. Reading was correct, because that's what I was doing. Whoever had written this had known I would be reading it today, on April 15th, and had left the entry for that date accordingly. That is the part that took my safe explanations away. If this were Danny, if Danny had somehow arranged all of this in advance during his February layover, the notebook would have had to be written before March 4th, before the tote appeared, before any of the other dates. That would mean he'd known in February that I would find each item on those specific dates, in that specific order, and respond in the ways described: found, looked, noticed, kept, stayed, listened, which is not something any person can know about another person's future behavior with that kind of precision. Unless the list wasn't predicting. Unless the list was recording and arriving slightly ahead of my noticing, which is a different thing entirely, and not a thing I have language for. I picked up my private notebook, the one I'd been keeping in my jacket pocket, and I compared my own handwritten notes to the dates in the spiral notebook. Every date matched, every item. The sequence I had been privately tracking had been written down somewhere else, in handwriting I recognized, and delivered to me this morning. I went back out to the shelves and looked at the far right section. The tote, the hoodie, the keychain, the tape, which I'd put back after listening to it, the spiral notebook, which I'd just returned to the fourth shelf. 5 items, on 5 different shelves, none of them claimed, none of them fitting any normal pattern of airport loss, and 1 empty space on the 5th shelf, the bottom shelf, the one we use for larger flat items, sports bags, guitar cases, that was currently bare. I had not noticed until that moment that the bottom shelf was bare. It's usually the least used one. But looking at it now, with the notebook's logic in my head, it read differently. It read like a reserved space. April 22nd. Something that wasn't lost yet. I called Danny that afternoon. Not the evening, the afternoon, which was unusual enough that he picked up, sounding slightly concerned. Everything okay? Yeah, I'm coming out the weekend of the 19th. I wanted to confirm. I've got it on the calendar, he said. Rachel's making that lamb thing you like. Good. Danny, I need you to... I stopped. Started again. Is there something you've been trying to tell me? Something you've been holding on to for a while? Silence. A different kind than his earlier confusion. This one had weight to it. Joel, you don't have to do it now. When I'm there. Yeah. He exhaled. Yeah, when you're here. It's yeah. So there was something real, something he'd been carrying, something he planned to tell me in person. That much was true. The tape had been right about that, whatever the tape was. I just didn't know yet whether what was coming on April 22nd was a thing Danny was going to give me, or a thing that was going to be taken. I flew out on the Saturday, April 19th, early flight. The kind that requires you to be at the airport before the coffee shops open. I drove myself and parked in the employee lot, which I'm not technically supposed to use for personal travel, and I walked through the terminal with my carry-on and felt the particular strangeness of being a passenger in a building I normally inhabit from the other side of the counter. I didn't go past the lost and found. I thought about it. The corridor was right there, past the baggage claim, and it would have taken maybe 3 minutes to badge in and check the shelves. But I didn't want to know what was there before I got to Phoenix. I wanted the order to be Danny first, then whatever April 22nd was. The flight was 2 hours and 40 minutes. I slept for most of it, which surprised me. I think my body had decided that sleep was something it could get on the plane because it wasn't sure what it would be getting afterward. Danny looked thinner. That was the first thing I noticed when he met me at arrivals, and I made myself look at it squarely rather than away from it. He'd lost weight in his face, which changes a person differently than losing it in the body. But he was standing straight, and he had color, and he smiled when he saw me, and the smile was completely his. He hugged me and held on for a second longer than usual. "You look tired," he said. 11 years at an airport will do that. Rachel had made the lamb. We sat around their kitchen table and ate and talked about things that had nothing to do with treatment schedules or what I'd found at work. and it was the best evening I'd had in months. Normal in the way that only becomes visible when normal has been scarce. Their dog kept putting his head in my lap. At some point, I realized I'd been laughing at something Danny said, and the laughter felt genuine all the way down. Not the kind you perform to maintain an atmosphere. We didn't get to the thing he needed to tell me that night. Rachel was there, and whatever it wasn't for her to hear. Or at least, Danny hadn't told it to her yet, because he kept almost starting, and then redirecting. I recognized the pattern, because I'd been watching him do it my whole life. He redirects when he's not ready, and I have learned not to push. Sunday was quieter. Rachel had plans with her sister, and Danny and I sat on his back porch in the dry Phoenix morning and drank coffee and watched his neighbor's citrus tree do nothing. He has a blood orange tree just visible over the fence, and I remember focusing on it because it gave me somewhere to look that wasn't at Danny. He said, "I need to tell you about Dad." I didn't say anything. Specifically about the last time I talked to him. Our father died 9 years ago. Heart attack, sudden, no prolonged illness. He was 61. He and I had a functional relationship by the end, meaning we'd gotten past the rougher parts of my teenage years and arrived somewhere that felt like mutual respect, if not closeness. I'd thought Danny had the same relationship with him that I did. Easy, not deep. Danny turned his coffee cup in his hands. 2 weeks before he died, he called me out of nowhere, which he didn't do. You know how he was about the phone. He called me and said he needed to tell me something about the family. About you. Something he'd figured out. About me. About why you are the way you are. Why we both are, a little. But you especially. He looked at the citrus tree. He'd been doing some reading about our grandfather, Mom's father, the one who died before we were born. Dad had gotten into the family records somehow. I don't know. Maybe Mom had told him something. But he'd found out that our grandfather had that there was a history in that line of something. A pattern, he called it, in the men. What kind of pattern? Danny set his cup down. They saw things before they lost people. Not visions. Nothing like that. Just objects. Items that showed up where they shouldn't be. Items that belonged to the person they were about to lose. Our grandfather found his own father's watch in a drawer that had been empty that morning, the day before his father died. Dad found his brother's, our uncle, the one who died young. Before we were born, Dad found his brother's jacket in the back of his own closet, a jacket he'd never owned, 3 days before the funeral. He looked at me then. Dad thought it was happening to him. At the end, he said things kept appearing, small things, and he wanted to warn me, or tell me, in case it was in the line, in case it passed down. He paused. He died before he could call you. He called me first because he thought I should hear it from him and then tell you myself when you were ready for it. I was quiet for a long time. The citrus tree was very still. "You've been waiting 9 years," I said. I kept thinking you'd never need to know, that it was just an old family story Dad had gotten fixated on, because he was, I don't know, intuiting his own death somehow. People do that. And then you never mentioned anything, and I thought, okay, it's skipped, or it isn't real, or Dad was just scared and looking for patterns. He stopped, and then I got sick, and I started thinking, what if it works the other way too? What if it's not just about losing someone? What if it happens to the person who might be lost? I let that sit. "I sent you a tape," he said, "through the airport." "I know. I didn't know how else to make you come without explaining everything on the phone. I needed to see your face when I said it." He looked down at his cup. "How long has it been happening?" 6 weeks, I said. Maybe 7. He nodded slowly, like that tracked with something internal. The photograph, I said. You made a copy from Mom's album. I mailed it to the lost and found address, in an envelope with no return address, addressed to the general intake. I thought if it showed up at your work, it would be, I don't know, a reason to pay attention. He shook his head. The tape I dropped in the slot on my way through in February. I had a longer layover than I told you. I came and put it in. The notebook, I said. The spiral notebook with the dates. He frowned. What notebook? I looked at him. Joel, what notebook? The one that was logged in on April 15th, with a list of dates. Every date that each item appeared, matched exactly, in a column. He was watching me carefully now, the way you watch someone when you're not sure if they're okay. I didn't send a notebook. I sent the photograph, the tape, and the book. The one I inscribed years ago and never gave you because I don't know why. I put it in the slot with the tape. The keychain, I said. The one that said Brothers. Joel, I don't know what you're talking about. We looked at each other across the porch table. The hoodie, I said. Tempe Brewery. I don't own a hoodie from any brewery. I sat back. The morning was warming up, the particular dry warmth of a Phoenix April that's nothing like the warmth back home, and I became aware of it suddenly, as a physical fact, the way you sometimes land in your own body without warning. Danny had sent 3 things: a photograph, a book, a tape. Everything else had come from somewhere else. The boarding pass with the future date, the keychain, the hoodie with a logo from a brewery I associated with Danny, but that Danny didn't own. The spiral notebook with dates he hadn't recorded. Items that were consistent with Danny's world, adjacent to him, close enough to be plausible, but not his. Something had been filling in around the edges of what Danny sent, adding to it, using the framework he'd created, and building inside it. The notebook had a final date, I said. April 22nd, 3 days from now, with a blank next to it, and a line underneath that said the last one isn't lost yet. Danny was very still. I thought it meant something was coming, I said. I thought maybe it meant you. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, quietly, maybe it doesn't mean me. I thought about the bottom shelf, the empty space, the one reserved position in the sequence. Joel. He leaned forward slightly. Maybe it means something you're about to lose, not a person. I didn't ask him to explain that. I understood what he meant, and I needed a minute before I could engage with it directly. Because what I might be about to lose, if the pattern held, if the family history our father had tried to describe before he ran out of time was real in the way it appeared to be real, was not Danny. It was the version of Danny I'd been maintaining in my head for the last 9 years. The one I'd kept at a comfortable distance. The easy, functional, not too close version of a relationship that I'd told myself was enough, because I hadn't wanted to examine whether it was. I'm not going to make this sound more articulate than it was, because sitting on that porch, it wasn't articulate. It was just a sick, recognizing feeling. The kind that comes when you've been almost knowing something for a long time, and the almost finally falls away. I had been emotionally managing Danny for years, the same way I managed everything efficiently, at arm's length, with good intentions and careful scheduling. Phone calls on birthdays, Thanksgiving when the flights worked out. I had told myself this was how adults maintained relationships across distance, which is partly true. And I had not told myself the other thing, which is that distance is sometimes chosen and sometimes constructed. I should have come sooner, I said, after the diagnosis. You called more. That's not the same. He didn't argue with that. We sat there for a while. The neighbor's citrus tree, the dry morning getting warmer, I thought about all the Aprils and Novembers and ordinary Wednesdays I'd spent being professionally good at things and personally economical about everything that required showing up in the full sense. "What did you need to say?" I asked. "The thing you couldn't say on the phone." Danny looked at his hands. "I was angry at you. For a long time after we stopped being close, I blamed you for it because you were the one who stayed comfortable, and I was the one who kept reaching a little, you know, and you kept being fine. And I decided, eventually, that was just who you were, that you were someone who was fine with less." He paused. "And then I got sick, and I realized I was going to die, having never told you that I didn't actually believe that. That I never actually believed you were someone who was fine with less. I think you just didn't know how to not be." I didn't say anything for a while. There wasn't a clean response to that. "I'm not asking you to apologize," he said. "I'm not even still angry. I just needed you to know I saw it. That I know you, even the version of you that keeps things at a distance. I still know you." That landed somewhere I wasn't prepared for. We didn't resolve anything exactly. There wasn't a resolution available, just an acknowledgement. And maybe that's what the thing in my lost and found had been building toward all along. Not a revelation exactly, not a piece of information, but a reason to be in this specific place, having this specific conversation, before whatever April 22nd held. I flew back Monday evening. I got to work Tuesday morning, April 22nd, 40 minutes before my shift started. I badged in through the back. I didn't turn on all the lights, just the row over the right section, and I walked to the far end of the shelves. The tote was there, the hoodie, the keychain, the tape, still on the third shelf where I'd replaced it, the spiral notebook on the fourth, and on the bottom shelf, the one that had been empty, there was now a single item. It was a photograph. Larger than the Kettle Lake one, printed on heavier stock, in a frame. A cheap frame, the kind you get at a drugstore when you want to protect something without spending much. The glass was slightly dusty, like it had been sitting somewhere for a while before it arrived here. I picked it up. It was a photograph of the whole family. Both of our parents, Danny, me. I'm maybe 14 in it, which puts Danny at 12. We're in the backyard of the house we grew up in, standing in front of the maple tree that our father planted the year I was born. My mother is laughing at something off camera. My father has his hand on Danny's shoulder. I'm standing slightly apart from the group, the way I apparently always stood. But I'm looking at Danny with an expression I don't remember making, something open and unguarded. On the back of the frame, written in marker, were 4 words. "You already know how." I stood in the dim room holding the frame. The shelves around me were quiet. All 5 items from the sequence. And now this. All of it sitting there together, unclaimed. In the room where lost things wait. The intake tray was empty. Nothing had come through the slot. Whatever had left this frame had not come through the drop slot. I checked the door first. Badge entry logs every swipe mine from 40 minutes ago was the only record since Marcus had locked up the previous evening. The drop slot has a spring mechanism that makes a specific sound when something passes through it. A dull metallic thud I've heard thousands of times, and the back room shares a wall with it. I'd been in the back room. I hadn't heard anything. The room had been locked. I was the only one who had opened it. I set the frame on the counter and stood back from it like distance would help me think. It didn't. I walked the perimeter of the room, which took about 45 seconds, and confirmed what I already knew: no other entry points, no windows, the drop slot aperture too narrow for a frame of that size regardless of anything else. I checked the drop slot anyway. I put my hand through it from the inside and felt the cold corridor air on my fingers and pulled my hand back. The frame was 8 inches by 10. The The slot opening is maybe 5 inches tall. I'm telling you this not because I think the measurements explain anything, but because I want you to understand that I checked. I am someone who checks. It's the thing I'm best at. Methodical verification. And I ran through everything available to me and came up empty. And then I stood at the counter and accepted that I was empty. The photograph in the frame showed my family in the backyard on a day I barely remembered. I am 14 in it, and already standing slightly outside the group. Not dramatically, just a half step removed. And my face looking at Danny has an expression that I apparently stopped allowing myself to make at some point in the following decade. I can't name it exactly. Undefended maybe. Like I hadn't yet learned to manage how much I let him see. You already know how. I thought about that for a long time. There in the early morning before Danny arrived, before the counter window opened, before the day became ordinary again. I thought about what it was I supposedly already knew. The tape had told me to come to Phoenix. I'd come. The notebook had told me something wasn't lost yet, implying it could still be kept. I'd had the conversation with Danny that I'd been failing to have for the better part of a decade. And now, this, a photograph of a version of myself that knew how to stand next to his brother without managing the distance, with a note on the back reminding me that person was still somewhere in the architecture. I don't know what left that frame. I've spent 14 months with that sentence, and I'm not closer to finishing it than I was that morning. I know what Danny sent: 3 items, confirmed by him, explicable by his February layover, and a few envelopes with no return address. Everything else belongs to a different category that I don't have a name for. Something that knew the family history our father had tried to document. Something that knew which items would be legible to me specifically, that understood the brewery hoodie and the keychain and the precise dates of my own noticing. Something that worked within the logic of my room, my system, my 11 years of cataloging, as if it had been watching me work long enough to understand what I paid attention to and how. I don't think it was malevolent. I want to be careful about that claim, because I recognize it might sound like comfort-seeking, like someone who's encountered something they can't explain, deciding it must be benign because the alternative is worse. But the evidence doesn't point toward malevolence. It points toward purpose. A sustained, patient, specifically calibrated purpose, which is something different. Whatever it was, it used what Danny started, and it finished the job he'd begun. Whether that's comforting or not, I genuinely can't tell you. Most days I land somewhere between the two. I didn't cycle the far right section that week. I kept finding reasons not to, which I'm aware is a pattern I'd established before I understood what was happening, and which I maintained afterward for different reasons. The tote bag went to 90 days, then past it. The hoodie, the keychain. I filed extension notes I didn't technically have justification for. Marcus looked at the section once and started to say something, and then didn't, which is one of the things I appreciate about him. About 3 weeks after April 22nd, I came in one morning and the section was empty. Not disturbed, not ransacked, just empty. Every item was gone. The tote, the hoodie, the keychain, the tape, the spiral notebook, and the framed photograph that I had placed on the bottom shelf the morning I found it. All 6 items, cleared overnight from a locked room with 1 entry point. The drop tray was empty. The badge log showed only Marcus's lockup from the previous evening and my own entry that morning. Nothing between. I stood in front of the bare shelves for a while. I'm not sure what I felt. Not relief exactly, and not loss exactly. Something in between. Like when you've been carrying something for long enough that you've calibrated your body to the weight of it, and then it's gone, and your muscles don't know yet how to stand upright without compensating. The items weren't in the donation bin. I checked. I asked Marcus if he'd cycled anything from the right section on his afternoon shift, and he said no. He'd left everything where it was per my instructions. I believed him. Whatever it was, it took its things back when it was done with them. I filed a discrepancy report that listed 6 items as missing from inventory. Cause unknown. It's the most bureaucratically useless document I've ever generated, and it's sitting in a physical file in the cabinet behind the counter, and I look at it sometimes when I'm doing end-of-month audits. And it tells me exactly nothing new every time. Danny's treatment changed in May. The second opinion doctor's approach involved a different combination of agents, more targeted, and the response was better than the first protocol. Not a reversal, not a cure. Nothing that dramatic. These things don't work dramatically. They work in small, incremental improvements that accumulate slowly enough that you keep not quite believing them. But by June, his numbers were moving in the right direction, and by August, the imaging showed what his oncologist cautiously called meaningful stabilization. He's still in treatment. He will be for a long time, maybe always. That's just the shape of it now. The ongoing management of something that won't be fully gone. I've had to learn to hold that without either catastrophizing it or minimizing it, which is harder than it sounds when your default is to process difficult information by filing it somewhere you don't have to look at it. I went back to Phoenix in June, then again in September. I didn't make a rule about it or put it on a schedule. Schedules are how I avoid things while appearing to honor them, and I was trying to break that habit. I just went when I could and stayed as long as made sense and let the visits be what they were, rather than what I managed them into. The conversation on the porch in April didn't fix anything. That's not how those conversations work. It just opened a door that had been shut long enough that we'd both started to forget there was a door there. After that, we walked through it sometimes, and sometimes we just stood in the backyard of our ordinary phone calls and talked about nothing important, and that was also fine. Maybe more than fine. Maybe the ordinary phone calls where nothing important gets said are exactly as necessary as the ones where everything does. I told him eventually about the items I couldn't explain. The keychain, the notebook, the hoodie, the frame. I told him what the notebook's final entry had said. He listened without interrupting, which is unusual for him. And when I was done, he was quiet for a moment. Dad told me the things that appeared for him felt like they were trying to help, he said. Not scare him. Like whatever it was wanted to give him a minute to prepare. He just didn't have enough time left to do much with it. He had enough time to call you, I said. Yeah, Danny said. He did. We left it there. I still work at Harwell. Same room, same shelves, same corridor with the half-stocked vending machine. I do my shelf walk every morning. I check the tray after overnight intake and log everything that comes through, and maintain the 90-day cycle with appropriate efficiency. The far right section fills and empties on its normal rotation now. Umbrellas and paperbacks and forgotten chargers, ordinary lost things waiting to be claimed or donated. I notice everything on those shelves. That hasn't changed. If anything, I notice more carefully than I used to, which is either a professional improvement or a form of waiting, and I haven't decided which. There is something I think about more than I expected to, more than the items themselves, or the notebook, or the photograph on the bottom shelf. It's something small that I keep returning to, the way you return to a room where something happened even after the thing itself is long over. The first morning when I found the tote bag with no intake tag, I almost cycled it immediately. Policy says untagged items get documented and processed within 24 hours, and I had no justification to hold it. I wrote the sticky note to myself, and then I didn't act on it, for no reason I could have articulated at the time. Call it habit or distraction. or the particular administrative inertia of a Tuesday morning with 17 other items to process. If I had cycled it, none of the rest would have had a context to arrive into. The sequence needed the first item to stay. It needed me to not do my job quite right, just once. So there was something already present when the next thing came. I don't know if whatever arranged all of this knew I would hesitate. I don't know if it chose my lost and found, specifically because 11 years of cataloging had made me someone who notices the wrong things on a shelf, or if it chose me for the family reason, the thing our grandfather passed down through the men in the line. Maybe both. Maybe it found someone who was the right kind of person working in the right kind of room. Lost things come through my door every day. Someone's reading glasses, someone's keys, objects that were in a person's hands and then weren't, that took on the status of lost. Not because they changed, but because the person moved away from them. Most of them get claimed. Some of them don't. The ones that don't aren't lost forever. They go to the county, get sorted, find their way to someone else who needs them. Nothing really terminates. It just changes custody. I think about that more than I used to. The framed photograph is the one thing I kept. Technically, I shouldn't have items without legitimate claimants or county property. But I wrote it off as damaged during handling and brought it home, and it's on the bookshelf in my living room now, between some paperwork I keep meaning to file and a plant that is doing better than expected. My family in the backyard, my mother laughing at something out of frame, my father's hand on Danny's shoulder, and me standing a half step outside the group with an open expression on my face that I'd forgotten I was capable of. I look at it sometimes when I'm on the phone with Danny. Not because I need to, just because it's there and he's there. And for a while, those two facts are happening at the same time, and that's enough. It is, I've found, usually enough. There's one more thing, and then I'm done. About 6 weeks ago, I was doing my morning shelf walk, the ordinary version. No anomalies. Everything tagged and dated and accounted for. When I got to the far right section, the miscellaneous shelves, there was an umbrella I didn't remember from the previous day. Black, standard folding type, no identifying information. I checked the overnight log. It was there logged properly by Donnie. Found near Gate 14. All correct. Gate 14. I looked at the umbrella for a moment. Then I wrote it up, verified the tag was legible, and moved on to the electronics section. It rained that afternoon, heavy and sudden, the kind of spring storm that catches people who checked the forecast in the morning and trusted it. I was leaving through the employee lot when it started, and I didn't have anything with me, and I stood under the entrance overhang for a minute considering my options. I thought about the umbrella. It was sitting on the far right section, second shelf, tagged and processed, waiting to be claimed. I left it where it was and made a run for my car. I want to be clear that I got pretty wet. It's a long employee lot. But whatever is in that room, whatever has been in that room, I'm not taking things from it anymore. I'll take what it offers when it offers it through the channels it used before, in the ways it used before, with the same sustained and patient intention it demonstrated across those 7 weeks in the spring of last year. Umbrellas I can buy.